Hey, Henning and MJ from FlippedNormals.com. In this video, we are going to cover how to create a tutorial series, specifically how do you structure your course. This is a series of 4 parts where the first one we covered how to set up, how to edit your videos and what equipment to use. And now we are taking one step further from there. So the first thing we're going to be covering is how do you get ideas for your tutorial series. This is a pretty interesting topic, and there isn't really like a one way to find ideas. Personally, what I'm doing when it comes to generating ideas for courses I want to do is I'm thinking about issues that I used to have in the past, and then I try to make tutorials for that. This is where you get to really test it on yourself instead of just seeking external validation right away. You immediately get an idea if this works or if this doesn't work. An example of this would be when both MJ and I were learning Blender some years back. We were both professionals. We've been doing 3D for years and years. And now going into Blender, it was really tricky to actually learn it. One of the reasons was because we didn't really care for beginner tutorials. There was no reason for us to sit down and just watch how do you install Blender for the 30th time or how do you add the node wrangler. It was more we just needed to get started with Blender. And that gave us the idea for switching to Blender for experienced artists. Essentially just a course where you're now an experienced artist and you just want to jump straight into Blender. And that became a quite successful course. Obviously, you also have to check out if the idea is good or not. So what I tend to do as well, I tend to ask a lot on social media. I tend to just ask people what do they want to see, and specifically once you've committed to your idea, write down the chapter outline and get feedback on that. What are you missing? What can you cut out? And generally, how can you edit your series?
Yeah, I think another interesting example there is our lighting scene that we did years and years ago. That came about the same way as a tutorial would. We were lighting a lot of portrait character shots, and we just thought to ourselves, how can we make our lives easier? Well, let's make a collection of different lighting scenes. And that's how that also turned into the lighting scene. So try to find the problems that you have yourselves and how you would want to solve it. You're almost guaranteed that other people will have similar issues.
Then the second thing we have to consider when we are starting a tutorial series, like this is meant for commercial courses. We're not just talking about YouTube here, though everything we do, we talk about most things here, it does apply directly to YouTube as well. That is, find a target audience. This is something that we learned really the hard way. When we made tutorials in the beginning, we just kind of made it for people. We didn't really think about who specifically was it for. And it sounds like a marketing thing, find your target audience, but this is much more than that. This is one of the more important things about making the course. If you're making a course for a complete beginner, you are going to design the course in a completely different way compared to if you're designing the course for somebody who's an advanced artist. And there are really 3 levels. We have the first one, which is a beginner. Then we have the second one, which is an intermediate artist. And then we have the third one, which is an advanced artist. Basically, we have 2 extremes, and then we have the in-between stages of this. So a beginner, we're defining somebody who has basically no experience with what you're teaching. If you're teaching a specific software, then this is somebody who's basically not touched the software before. The assumption is that they will need to know every single button and every single feature explained in detail. Then we have the intermediate artist. This is the person who's been doing this for a few years. They're not extremely comfortable with software, but they can kind of manage by themselves. And they know how to model, texture, do some lighting, but the stuff they're doing, it doesn't necessarily look 100%. It's pretty decent, but it has a long way to go. And then you have the third level, which is advanced. And this is where the artists can work quite independently. They don't really need tutorials day to day. They quite rarely need tutorials, but they need tutorials maybe on how to really push the work to the next level. This is an example here is a course that Ben Erd made for us not too long ago, which is a course that Morten and I would really, or MJ and I would really need. It's something where you're taking it really to the next level instead of just focusing on like the specific technicals.
I think one of the mistakes that a lot of people make, especially in the beginning when they start creating tutorials, is that when you don't have that focus of what skill level or your target audience is going to be, you tend to be a little bit all over the place. You might have an idea in mind that you want to make a beginner type of tutorial, but if you don't have that sort of like hard coded in that you need to actually, show the key presses, talk about the hotkeys, show where everything lives in the menus, you might create this hybrid of it's partly a beginner tutorial. Some parts are for intermediate artists and other things are for advanced artists. And then all of a sudden you end up with this mix of a tutorial that no one can really follow. Like beginners, it's too advanced for them. And for the advanced artists, it's not advanced enough. That's the danger of not actually having a target audience in mind. I think where it can work is if you're creating a more theoretical course. It's not so much about how do I specifically model a gun and hard surface. It's more like focused on lighting techniques. You talk about color theory. Things of that nature can work a little bit better without a specific target audience in mind. But I think it's always good to try and direct it towards like a certain segment of students.
Yeah, this is the elusive foundational or fundamental.
Yeah,
level,
I didn't want to get
really
into. I didn't want to get into that yet, but
comes a little bit later. But yeah, there's definitely like a fourth, slightly elusive one called all skill levels. But essentially, you have beginner, intermediate, and then you have advanced artists. And it's really important, really, to keep this in mind because, like, literally everything you do is going to be dependent on that. If you try to make the end result too fancy, it means beginners can't follow. There is too many steps. And if you make the end result too simple for an advanced audience, they're not going to care because they know how to do that kind of stuff in their sleep. And this leads us to our next point, which is make the end result really appealing. This is probably one of the things MJ and I've learned the most from doing courses when it comes to making the courses sell well. If your end result looks really hot, you're just going to sell a lot more copies than if it doesn't. It's as simple as that. And this is not just a case of making like the final render super nice. It's every single step of the way where you have like attractive looking scene files so you can have that in gallery. But definitely most importantly is that the final result in your course looks really good. This is one of the things we've done for our courses, that for intro courses, the problem with intro courses is that inherently the end result doesn't look good because they're very segmented. Like now we're learning about lighting, now we're learning about color space, and they're not really connected up. And there isn't really a good way to connect them up. But what we do is we have them two parts. One part is just not connected pieces, which just are really to the point. And then part two is let's make something that looks cool. And one of the reasons for that is, well, obviously it gives the students some sense of mastery, but also it's much easier to sell the course. To be perfectly honest, that's a huge part of why we make the part two. Just you have nice marketing materials for that.
That's one of the tricky things with especially beginner type of courses, where if you rely on a lot of assets, for example, pre-made assets or things that you need to buy in order to follow the tutorial, like let's say, aside from the software that you're using, and you want to create like environments or something, you need to buy a lot of assets to populate it in order to just follow the tutorial. I think for beginners, it can be a little bit of a deterrent because no matter what, they'll never end up with that super nice result in the tutorial. Whereas for advanced artists, that doesn't make that much of a difference. You just kind of need to know the techniques. But as Henning said, for marketing, from a marketing perspective, the end result is that's really everything. That's how you're going to sell your course ultimately to your customers.
Yeah, you're going to be using that on every single area. Like when you're selling on FlippedNormals.com, you're going to have the thumbnail, you're going to have the gallery, you're going to have like a featured image if we feature it somewhere. You have all the different gallery images. You have the trailer as well. And then whenever we are featuring it on our social media as well, it's so much easier to feature it. We've had great products that we really can't feature because while they're great, there is nothing visual to show. If you're sharing an image on Instagram, you can't share it if the end result doesn't look very good. So like if it's a course on modeling, spend the extra few hours just popping it into Blender or IRA or whatever it is, and just make it look really nice. It's going to pay it back. It's going to pay for itself many, many times over.
I think it's one of the sad things like about creating courses like that is that you can have the best course on something. It might, objectively just be the best information in a type of course that's out there, but people, they buy with their eyes. They look at it, they see, does it look professional? Does it look cool? Does it look good? Yes, that's the one I'll buy. And if you don't spend that extra time to create nice and appealing visuals, yours might just, not sell compared to your competitors.
It also makes sense when you think about it as well, because we're all visual people. Most people in this industry, they want to just make cool stuff. And if you have a super nice end result, people are just wanting to make that thing. So it really makes sense when you think about it. But also it's, it would be great if we could judge it just objectively based on the educational value.
Yeah.
That's just really hard. We assume that nice end result means good tutorial when that's not necessarily the case. No. Then we have two topics that are things you should not do. The first one is no time lapses. We highly, highly advise you to never, ever, ever in any circumstances use time lapses. This is a little bit different for YouTube videos because it's just a bit of a different format. But for commercial courses, just don't include time lapses. They are incredibly annoying from a customer point of view. Customers just don't like time lapses. We've seen this time and time again. We used to have time lapses in our earlier courses, and the reason was not to be lazy or anything. It was the opposite. It takes more work to do them. It was to save the time for the person who was watching the tutorial. Maybe we're going over something that's extremely repetitive. Let's say we're sculpting something and it's just the same thing over and over again for like 3 hours. We're like, well, let's just time lapse it up to like an hour. Well, it turns out people actually want to see those 3 hours. They just need to see specifically how you solve a specific part of the character.
Yeah, it was interesting because we were trying to solve an issue we thought people had. It turns out they didn't. It was the opposite. We were creating an issue, so we speak from bitter experience here, which is interesting. We, like Henning said, we wanted to save people's time. We wanted to be respectful about it. But in the end, especially, I think the more beginner you are, the more important it is to see every single step, every single click. And it takes less work for you to actually not do a time lapse compared to doing a time lapse. And then people can always speed up the footage themselves, in their video player. If they want to see it, okay, this is just a sculpting section. Let me just put it on 2 times, 3 times speed and just enjoy it that way. Don't try to force a certain way of viewing your tutorial on your customers.
Yeah, because you don't really know what the skill level of the artist is. And particularly if it's something that is more step by step, sometimes the people the people watching the videos are literally like step framing the videos because there's one frame showing the button you clicked, right? Yeah. So it's terrible. I think it boils down to essentially that when you time lapse something, information is lost. Like you can never retrieve it again. Like you lost just like 2/3 of your frames now, or even more than that. Well, if you just leave it the way it is, people can always speed it up themselves. Bracket keys in VLC. Use those keys a lot. They're gonna save you so much pain.
I remember us trying to come up with the what is the max speed up we can do that's still comfortable to watch when you're doing sculpting. And you're just, like I said, you're just creating a lot more work for you that your customers in the end actually don't really appreciate.
The next point is very dear to my heart. Keep your videos on point. This is something that is infuriating if you're watching tutorials where specifically, I've seen this a lot if you're doing something, not just modeling, but if you're dealing with like the more later stages, maybe it's like lighting or look at shading, that kind of stuff, where what you're trying to learn is, let's say you're trying to learn how to light a scene. Now, the author of the tutorial might spend 20 minutes building the scene. First, delete the standard cube, and then you build up the scene in your assigned materials. When you don't care about that, the video is actually just about how do you set up some lights and how do you set up an HDRI. That is the meat of the video. Get to that right away. Start the video with something like, hey, this is how you set up an HDRI in Arnold. Click these buttons. Scene is already been set up for you. And then you learn it right away. This makes it so much more enjoyable. And just makes it easier for you as well. It means there's less to record as well. It's hard to record videos. If you can record a video that's 5 minutes instead of 20, everyone is grateful for that.
Yeah, I remember seeing a lot of this stuff this is particularly prevalent on YouTube, I think, which is an interesting thing when you're creating a video with a very specific title. let's say in Blender, how to turn on the Node Wrangler add-on. That could be the title of your video. Well, if someone found your video, it's most likely because they searched for something similar. Don't spend time showing them how to install Blender as well. I mean, I know that is like an extreme example, but it happens more often than you would think. If they searched for how to install Blender and then turn on Node Wrangler, cool, they're asking for it. But most likely, if you're creating specific content videos, if for YouTube or if it's for paid courses, people know what they're getting themselves into. They don't expect some other hidden thing to be present in there.
I prefer to get right to the point and then get to the, basically make the videos less relevant as you go along. This is a bit different for YouTube because of, the algorithm and all that, but particularly for courses, let's say the video is how to use HDRIs in Arnold. You go in the beginning, boom, this is how you do it. The whole thing is really 20 seconds, and then you can spend 10 minutes talking about tips and tricks on how to optimize that and really squeezing out all the knowledge you have about the topic. That can be really useful because there is a lot more to there is a lot more to it than just the little technique you have. But just make sure people get it in the beginning of the video. This becomes very important, and I can guarantee you that if you stay very true to, or if you get straight to the point, you're going to get much higher reviews as well. People are going to appreciate that. And this is relating to the next point as well, which is prepare scene files before you're actually recording. For every single video I do, particularly if it's a technical one, introduction to Maya, introduction to Painter, where you just need to go through specific features, just sit down and prepare scene files for every single one of the videos beforehand. It has a few benefits. The first one is that you get to practice the first time. You get to think through what's the best way to talk about a specific feature. But also it's a lot better for the people going through your course, since now they can follow exactly what you're doing. There's no back and forth, or they don't have to make their own scene files. It's just exactly what you're working with, and it means they're going to learn a lot faster. And you supply the scene files afterwards, and you have more content, and the course looks a lot more professional. Then we have a bit of bigger discussion here. This is something we've talked about on the channel before, but basics versus fundamentals is a big topic. Oh yes, and
so controversial.
We're gonna do so controversial. This is going to be a short discussion on that. But essentially, you have two kinds of big topics, or two ways of breaking down anything complicated. You have into the basics part, then you have into the fundamental part. The specific words we're using isn't that important, but the point is, one of them is how do you do something you can Google. How do you delete a layer in After Effects? It's a very specific thing you do. And this can even be complicated things, like how do you set up an explosion in Houdini, a highly specific explosion. Can be a lot of steps, but at least it's step by step. Then you have the other part, the foundation, or the fundamental part. This is the why you do something. This could be introduction to cinematography, where it's not about how you create the lights, it's why do you place the lights where they're placed. If you were to look at highly effective scenes in 3D, maybe they only have 4 lights, but they're placed in the perfect spot, and they have the perfect color temperature and all that. And this goes into the why. All this is to say that you need to be sure that your course is made specifically for one of these, where either it's a course where you're going through a lot of basics, which is like introduction to Maya, introduction to Blender, these kind of things, where it's all about teaching people mechanical things, stuff they could Google, but it's collected in one spot. And then you have the other course, which is something more akin to our introduction to sculpting course. That's way more fundamentals. It's stuff you can't really Google. It's like appeal, explaining appeal to somebody. You can't just Google, how do I make my character more appealing, and apply like a Python script, right? It's a much broader discussion than that. So figure out, are you teaching a basic course or a fundamental course? Or it can be both, but make sure specific videos is for the basic part and specific videos is for the fundamental part.
I would say if we take lighting as an example of this, a good way to think about it, let's say you were to join these together in a course, is you would start out with the why, the fundamental of it. Why do we need lights? What do lights do? Why does color temperature affect our mood, the way we see things, those kinds of topics. Teach people something that is the whys are not really that tangible always, but then you can take the whys and then you can apply the hows afterwards. So you cover all the fundamentals of lighting, and then you can have a practice session afterwards where we go through the hows. Okay, so how do we set up specifically a studio light or a studio setup? And we take our fundamentals that we've just learned: color, temperature. How does things affect human skin if we're lighting, I don't know, a watermelon studio shots with products or people, those differences. And then you apply those specifics afterwards. Like, okay, so we need to use this exact color temperature, and we need to have the lights in just these spots, so that's a way that you can combine them. But they're two very different things, but you need them both, really.
I find that the more advanced you go, the more fundamental knowledge you include. Let's say you're doing a beginner course on lighting and you're trying to go into the whole, why do you put the light here? Let's go into cinematography of Blade Runner. And the student's gonna be like, look, this is all cool, but I don't even know where to place the light. I don't even know what an area or direct light is, or what on earth an HDRI is. So if you're trying to go too fundamental before you've really done anything, it doesn't really matter. So my general rule of thumb is beginner courses, more basic, and you go more fundamental the more advanced you go. We have, for instance, a fantastic sculpting course by Christian Boll on sculpting, and that's a course I learned a lot from. And he doesn't really show you the interface. He doesn't talk about what brushes he uses. Pure observation and how do you think about things is pure fundamental. But that's an advanced course. It's not for like complete beginners, because the complete beginner will be like, yeah, this is cool. I understand kind of what you're trying to say, but what brush are you using, right?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting thought that sort of you need a certain skill level in something in order to properly follow a fundamental tutorial. Like take anatomy as an example. Often a beginner tutorial for anatomy would be, how do I sculpt the abs? How do I sculpt the pecs? How do I sculpt the face? How do I sculpt the human body? That's a how. That's a basics type of video. That's not a fundamentals video. A fundamentals video with anatomy would be figuring out shape, form. How does things interconnect? Why does anatomy work the way it does? And in order to understand that, I feel like you will have a better grasp of it if you've tried to sculpt something first and failed. If you've tried to sculpt the pecs, but it doesn't look quite right, but you have kind of an understanding of it. I feel like at that point, your mind is geared towards better understanding the fundamentals of anatomy, for example.
Now, recording tutorials is extremely tricky, and it just takes a lot of practice. But even if you've been doing this for a long time, you are still going to be making a lot of mistakes. And I tend to think of it as there are two kinds of mistake. You have the first one, which is just you doing a brain fart. This is just what I think about as a Henning issue. This is just where you're doing something that shouldn't really happen. And these are the kind of mistakes you just need to edit out and backtrack and fix the mistake so it's not in the video. The worst thing you can do is to lead somebody down a path. They're spending like an hour on doing something, and then you just tell them, yeah, sorry, you have to kind of erase all that. The second kind of mistake is if there's legit some educational knowledge in this. This could be if you are, let's say you're exporting out a displacement map from Maya, and the mid value is correct. Instead of using 0, using 0.5, or vice versa, depending on your system. So now when you bring this into Blender or Arnold for Maya and you apply the map, everything is just going to like balloon up. It's going to look completely wrong. And this is a perfect opportunity for you to go, okay, here you can actually see why mid value is important. It's not just a setting that you're randomly setting. If the mid value is wrong, this is what's going to happen. This happened to me. It's a simple mistake to make. Here's how you fix it. Now we're fixing the issue and see how much better it looks. This is the kind of mistake that's handy to have in, because you're making a mistake that a lot of other people are 100% going to make. But you don't want to you don't want your videos to be full of mistakes as well. Like, you shouldn't just go, well, the videos are just unedited. It needs to be, you need to kind of curate the videos and include only mistakes when it makes strategic sense, when you're learning from when people can legit learn from your mistakes.
Yeah, I think it's easy to, as a content creator of any kind, to make it appear as if, you just know your things perfectly. So, for example, with our videos, we do sculpting, especially when we do sculpting, right? A lot of that stuff has been edited out when we're looking at references or fixing proportions. So it all looks just like, okay, every single brush stroke just is very strategic. It's not always the case. And there are always mistakes that will be made, even things that aren't necessarily mistakes. Back to what Henning was talking about earlier, in terms of preparing your scene files and being very direct in your approach. That you're not experimenting. Experimenting is also sort of a mistake when you're trying to teach someone something specific. Like, I don't know, how to light outside environments for a forest, for example. You should have a general idea, or even a very specific idea of what you want the scene to look like. You've done it before. You've already created a scene, so you know exactly the type of values that your lights would need that make it look good. You can talk about the experimentation phase that you did to get there, but you don't necessarily have to show them the 10, 20, 30 minutes of playing around until you get that, perfect color combination.
I always find it to be funny in videos where I do this all the time as well. I'm sure you do it as well, where you're trying to find a highly specific setting for some material or something, and you just happen to get it right first time. Yeah, the exact roughness one was 0.425, and you just happen to get the right. Now, if you're doing that stuff, I think it's important to go, look, this is tricky. There's a lot of fiddling back and forth. A low value is going to do this. A high value is going to do this. You have to balance it. I've already prepped this so that you know that this is the correct value. Because otherwise, all the value just happens to be 100% correct. But I find that to be particularly hard as well if you're doing if you have to do highly specific technical things like with nodes and such. You just have to prepare beforehand, and you do not experiment during the video, because you are going to 100% screw that up. Experiment beforehand.
Usually what I like to do to save my students from me having to experiment and go through things like that is on my second monitor, I will have a sheet or even the scene file, the old scene file open with the exact values that I need. That way I have a range that I know that I should go for. And so within that range, I know things are going to look good. Like Henning said, especially with nodes, it gets really tricky with specific values. So giving yourself a range that you can use helps save time for the people who are watching.
Yeah, I had somebody who messaged me being like, well, when Henning makes a dwarf sculpt, like referring to intro to sculpting, he just opens up a sphere and shubidi do there is a dwarf like 2 hours later. Oh. Yeah, there is. But that's because it's not because I've been editing out a whole lot, it's because I've been preparing beforehand. This leads to, the earlier point. The sculpt is done. Yeah. Because if not, then we're experimenting live and you don't know if it's going to work, which ties into make the end result super appealing. So it all really ties together here. Yeah,
and not oftentimes, actually, I would say every single time, especially for our courses, if you watch us create something, we've already created that once or maybe twice before. Had it go through feedback rounds internally in the office and look through it. How can we tweak it so that when we sit down and do it again for a course, it's sort of, there's things in muscle memory now. There are things that we remembered how to do, so we don't experiment and have to figure out how to do it for the first time live as we're teaching it.
I mean, to be perfectly honest, this entire video I'm doing for the second time because I tried to record it yesterday and the whole thing messed up. Another point as well that I think is very important is don't do too much custom stuff with your software, particularly if you've been doing this for a long time, which you probably have when you're making tutorials. You've customized the crap out of your software. That's awesome. It means that you get to work super fast. But that's not really what your goal is here. Your goal is not to impress people and work as fast as possible. Your goal is to teach people. So for instance, in both Blender and Maya, I have a quite custom setup, but when I'm teaching this software, I don't use any of that because it would actually be impossible for people to follow, particularly if you're working in Blender, which is so hotkey based. If you have a lot of different hotkeys, people will literally not be able to follow what you're doing, particularly if you're using a lot of custom add-ons or scripts or anything like that. So I tend to stick to as vanilla as possible for my software. And then if I do have to customize something, which I do have for both Maya and Blender, there are some things there that I think is just not good UX, and you can fix it very simply with just a few hotkey binds. Make a video talking about this is how you customize it, this is why I customized it. For kind of an exceptions there is for ZBrush, where I'm more like, I'm not really explaining the interface, I'm more like supplying the interface. But it's still valid because it's more for like advanced courses where it's more about the actual sculpting. It's not about step by step doing something in ZBrush, because if you're doing that, then you want to be sure to do stuff as vanilla as possible. But if you're doing more advanced stuff, feel free to customize it to some extent, but really explain all your choices.
Yeah, typically what we'll do is we'll have a dedicated chapter, actually, that people can skip if they don't want it, right? But we'll have a dedicated chapter sort of along the beginning where it's like, okay, watch this chapter on how we've set up or customized our interface, our software, whatever it is, as well as what Henning said, having the supplied hotkeys, add-ons, whatever it may be, along in the project files.
Yeah, it's just gonna make it much more comfortable for the students to follow along. And speaking of more comfortable as well, once we're done with the whole course, I really like to make maybe around a 5 to 10 minute video explaining the main course. Just go make a little edit of it in like Premiere or DaVinci, whatever you prefer, and put together some of the main videos, or go through the scene files and just open up the scene files one by one and talk through the process. This kind of like primes the brains for the people going through the course, where they know what to expect at every single level. At no point is the thing you're creating just kind of appearing out of nowhere. It's always going through the different stages, and you get to talk through about it in a bit more of a holistic sense. Instead of talking about specific technicals, you get to give them an overview of the project, and also they get to learn exactly what they're going to create, which I think is really important.
Yeah, it sort of becomes kind of a trailer in a way. Obviously, I would do a dedicated trailer as well, but it's sort of like when you're in the course trailer for the rest of the course. It's really important to be able to give people a proper overview of what's going to be happening.
And speaking of a proper overview, when you're making the course, it's really helpful to have specific notes for the specific videos. I do this for every single course I'm creating, and when I'm making the notes, I'm always thinking about that people are going to read my notes. These are not just like internal ones. And I keep supplying them as PDF files. Of course, I edit them a bit afterwards to make them even nicer, more presentable, adding like a bit of like an index to them and such. And people really appreciate that. It means it's a lot easier for people to go back and just quickly get some information. Let's say you have a chapter just on specific hotkeys. They can just open up the PDF, which is obviously much easier to do than watching through a video. And they can just get all the notes here as well. So this is something I do for every single course I make. Make a proper PDF and just teach people how to do it. Even if you're doing a kit. We just released the FlippedNormals Face VDMs as well, which is just a kit, it's not a tutorial. But even in there, we're including like install instructions. We used to do it kind of just as like a TXT file, but now we've upgraded that to being like proper nice PDFs. It just means it's a lot easier, means that people are gonna feel better with your product, means you're gonna get better reviews, more sales, and more importantly, people are going to have a better experience with your product, which is obviously the main goal with what you're creating.
I think all of that ties together in terms of how you're trying to sell your course, right? And all of it adds up and makes it look more professional, more presentable. The more you can do to have or to give your customers a better experience, the better people will review it, the better the better they will like it. If it's a complete package, I think overall you're just going to be better off. And something like a PDF, supplying a PDF with everything might seem small, but is that taking that extra care, some extra effort to help people get into your course, have an overview, if it's a list of hotkeys, if it's a list of common mistakes, whatever it may be, I think it all ties together to help give them a better experience.
So all that, combine all the things we've been talking about now, this is really a recipe for how you can create really successful courses, and then you can sell them on, for example, FlippedNormals.com, which obviously we highly recommend that you do. This is an accumulation of everything we've picked up over the last, we've been doing this for like 10 years or so. And
yeah.
I wish we had this knowledge back in the day, particularly like set the target audience. That stuff was very useful for us.
Yeah.
So I hope you enjoyed this video and that it really helps you to create better courses in the future. And we'll see you in the remaining 2 parts of this series.